Hello, welcome. I'm Jay Carpenter of PhoneWord Workshops, and today is Wednesday, August the 20th, 2014. It is about 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and today we're having the third Wednesday workshop, and we're continuing the conversation about SIP and ENUM and how they work together, how they might work in the future. And with any luck at all, we will have Bayan Tofig of FlowRoute joining us. FlowRoute is a provider of SIP trunking services. So we're waiting for Bayan to join. And I'd just like to say that the PhoneWord workshops are designed to be primarily technically oriented, and they're offered on the second Wednesday of the month and the third Wednesday of the month. Hey, Brian, were you able to get the invitation to the Hangout or no?
No, I wasn't.
Okay. Okay, cool. Well, we'll just go with this format then. And thank you for joining today.
Thank you.
So the intention of the PhoneWord workshops is to go into kind of a deep dive on some technical topics surrounding what's happening today in telecommunications, media delivery, the all IP transition, and today we're talking about SIP and ENUM, and delighted to have Bayan with us, who's the Chief Executive Officer of FlowRoute, and FlowRoute is a SIP trunking provider. And Bayan, would you tell us a little bit about FlowRoute and what you folks do and you know, what you're out to accomplish?
Sure. So FlowRoute is a software company that provides voice and messaging services now to developers and service providers. So we have a few service providers running on our network. We have large enterprises using this for voice and messaging. We have developers building applications on our platform. We are selected in the portability region in the United States, and we're very involved in both the technology aspects of telecom as well as the regulatory and industry.
Okay. And could you tell us a little? I know you've got a great background with Asterisk, and you've done some cool things in the world of telecom. Could you tell us a little bit about what you've done in that realm?
Sure. I grew up in the telecom industry. I was 13, 14 years old. I was immersing telephone operators and telephone company technicians. Fast for a few years. When I was 17, I found the first rotary phone in one of the early versions of Asterisk, and gained some publicity there, and started doing some telecom consulting to pay my way to college. That took me around the world working for tech companies and telecom companies through college, and I moved to the Philippines just after college, and started secure phone service that later segued into FlowRoute. So my interest is from the beginning. Then, how can we look at telecommunications with fresh set of eyes and put together a service, a platform that gives people the access and control that they don't traditionally have. And so I think that the big problem in telecom today is threefold. One is that the cost of voice services is a thousand times more expensive than data for no technological reason. And the second is access. It's a lot easier to get Skype ID or a Gmail account than it is to get a phone number. It's a lot harder to scale telecom services. And the third is control. In the data world, you have control to infrastructure at the service and application layers. And the telephone network is walled off. It's a parallel network where you have some specialized providers providing limited access at various layers at a very high cost.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I think a lot of those problems are now coming to the forefront, especially with an ENUM transition that the FCC is leading with the IP transition, and the point of differentiation that used to exist is now changing. The service and the conduit are no longer synonymous, and so a lot of the traditional carriers who have invested in massive physical infrastructure see that their strengths are in being data companies now, in being the conduit. And voice is becoming a data service. It's not quite there yet, but the industry and regulation is clearly moving in that direction.
Agreed. And I think there's there's an interesting confluence going on in the industry where people still see voice as being this distinct thing. And for me, Brian, it's like trying to separate voice or the audio out of a YouTube experience. It's really becoming all one and the same. And your point about addressing, I think, is right on as well. That it's so much easier to get an email address or Skype name or whatever address you want to use than it is to get a telephone number. And the other thing that I think is pretty key is that people seem to have telephone numbers collapsed with SIP addresses as well as with fully qualified domain names that exist in a registry that is, let's say, an ENUM registry. And, in my opinion, they're distinct items for sure. So anyway, I love your points about the cost differential between voice, legacy voice, and contemporary audio. What I'm seeing is that, especially with what folks like over FreeSwitch, what they are doing, where they're now delivering stereo audio and three-dimensional audio, via WebRTC. When you look at the quality constraints, excellent. We've got Peter Segede with us from the Netherlands. Peter, can you hear me okay?
Hey, hello everyone. I can hear you very well.
Awesome. Great. Peter, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Bayan Tofig of FlowRoute. Bayan, Peter is in charge of a group called enrenum.net, which is a global consortium of academic and research institutions that are ushering in a new realm of what I'll call end-user opt-in ENUM, an ENUM that's specifically designed for academic settings and connectivity. And Peter Bayan is, in addition to being the CEO of FlowRoute, he is also a newly elected director for the SMS 800 Inc., which governs all toll-free telephone numbers in North America. And Bayan is active in many of the policy realms and let's say, well, policy and regulatory realms associated with what I would call contemporary communications and connectivity. So I am delighted to have you two connected today.
Nice to meet you, Peter.
Nice to meet you. Thank you very much for the introductions.
So, do either of you have anything you'd like to add at this point, or any comments? Anything, Peter, you'd like to say about what you folks at ENUM are doing these days?
Well, I think you summarized it very well. So basically, we have this global ENUM service designed for academia, so research education. This whole thing is governed, operated by the research education networks, and we use it as a preferred or recommended dialing method for voice and video communications within the community. It's growing rapidly. We have new countries joining every year, and as I said, it's promoted by the research education networks on top of the high quality, high bandwidth network that we are doing, and it leverages all the video and voice real-time communication efforts of the community.
Great. And you folks just, what was it, about a month or so ago, you had a conference in Europe. Anything you'd like to share with us about what's happened at the conference level lately, Peter?
Yeah, well, we have this big annual conference every year, which is the Trainer Networking Conference. It attracts around 600-700 people all around the globe, I would say. At this meeting, we did not really touch on the real-time communication issue particularly, but I can tell you that there is a new project which is called the Géant 4 project starting April next year. And in that project, I'll be the activity leader responsible for real-time communication stuff, which includes video, voice, and also streaming and archiving services in this area. So that's the latest news that I can share with you. This will start in April next year, as I said, with 3 tasks, and we'll focus more on a global unified communication solution for higher education and universities, and also for big science researchers.
Awesome. Well, Peter, just so you know, Bayan and I attended the FCC workshop on March the 25th with the Federal Communications Commission. So actually, both Bayan and I were very vocal at the workshop, talking about the direction where the numbering test bed could go, and how that might take shape. I think, Bayan, you were bringing up some very interesting points about, hey, if we're at this juncture, why don't we really take a deep look at naming and addressing and numbering the whole gamut, and really design something that's powerful. So is there anything you'd like to add to that, Bayan, about the numbering test bed workshop and where that's all at?
Yeah, I think that there's one of the most interesting changes that's going to come out of the modernization of numbering is the telephone numbers, at least according to the FCC, will not be directly assigned to carriers anymore, not 5, 6, 7 years from now. And users will be registering telephone numbers directly. And the telephone numbers will no longer be solely a means of addressing, but they'll also be a means of identity. So in order to have that, there has to be some level of authentication. So phone numbers will come with a password. This brings about a whole bunch of problems in terms of addressing routing, where solutions like ENUM are being looked at very closely. And we were having discussions about distributed architectures for numbering and routing, as well as some different centralized ones. How authority is delegated, and it's of course still a work in progress. And there's a lot of complexity around there, and a lot of adjacent elements that influence the discussion. For example, the IP transitions, which are very, very complex, but also there's a lot of tension in those discussions around IP transitions. And in my mind, a lot of this tension comes about because we're looking at voices being a separate legacy network that needs to be separated, and a lot of the players involved have a very strong interest in keeping it separated. But I think that there are some things that can move the telephone network to being more like a data service over the next few years in a de facto way, without relying heavily on regulation and policy.
I agree, and one of the really cool things that ENUM is working on or has talked about, and actually Peter and a fellow named Bernie Herneisen have appeared on the PhoneWord forum, and they're looking at virtual numbers. So I don't know where that stands currently with you, Peter, but the experimenting with virtual numbers that aren't provisioned on the PSTN, something like country code 1 and then 100. I think that's got some really interesting potential in the context and realm of ENUM, and then when you start to apply constructs like WebRTC, I think it opens up some really, really interesting possibilities. Peter, have you folks done much with the virtual number issue at this point, or is that still on the planning stages?
I would say it's still on a planning stage. We still have the recommendation that our members should not use, or at least not populate virtual numbers into the ENUM tree that we are using at the moment. Although there are some plans how we can include virtual numbers as a temporary solution for issues, especially driven by the fact that telephone numbers currently are not available as single resources or identifiers in many countries in Europe. But as Brian mentioned, this is coming as a push from regulators to make these resources available, and then probably will take away the need for virtual numbers. But at the moment, we are seeking for ways to include them into the dialing schema without actually clashing or breaking the schema.
Okay, cool. All right. Either one of you have any comments at this point? Any questions? I'm going to go into, I put together a brief presentation, and I'm going to hop into that, maybe. Let's see here. All right. So bear with me just a moment. Okay. So the topic for today is SIP and ENUM. How do they work together? How could they how might they evolve over time? And my question, and it's basically to both of you, and Brian, I think you're certainly the expert in this area. SIP and ENUM, do we really need both? So I'm showing a session initiation protocol diagram that's taken from Wikipedia, and it just basically shows diagrams the SIP invite process, and then establishing a media path, and that whole process, which has been with us and basically is a backbone of IP telephony as it stands today. And certainly, and then the next slide that I'll show is a schema of ENUM, where there's a lookup into a registry, public DNS, to connect points, and then the media follows its own path once that lookup process has taken place. So my question is, well, first of all, certainly SIP and ENUM are designed to work together, and many of the NAPTR specifications are designed to accommodate SIP. My question is, if we had a fully deployed ENUM registry, a global ENUM registry, would we still need SIP? And I'll turn it over to you, Bayan. And
yeah, I think definitely we need SIP. There's no question about that in my mind. If you go to that slide that shows the ENUM and the cloud in the middle,
right, I'm there
with the two PBXs.
Mm-hmm.
There's the number 4 there is some kind of signaling protocol, which is probably SIP. It could also be peer-to-peer WebRTC, or it could be some other means of signaling. But ENUM is simply a translation from the unique ITU telephone number to some kind of an address, whether it's for voice or messaging or whatever it may be, and you still need that protocol to communicate. The same way that when you have a domain name and you do a DNS lookup, you still need the HTTP protocol to speak to the web server. There's ENUM is equivalent to DNS for telephone numbers. It runs on the DNS protocol, and SIP is equivalent to HTTP for communications, whether it's telephone calls or video or a number of other applications that could be developed on top of SIP. There are definitely problems with the architecture of SIP 2.0, but I think it's widely enough used and ubiquitous enough that it's not really going anywhere anytime soon. I don't think we're going to see SIP replaced by H323 again anytime soon or anything like that. There's definitely a need for some way to signal, and I think SIP is probably going to be the way that we do a lot of this going forward.
Well, for sure, you need the pathway for the signaling and the transport. But let's assume on this diagram, section 4 here, where we're going from PBX to PBX, for sure, you need SIP in that for that connectivity. But let's replace the PBX notation with Chrome browser to Chrome browser.
Sure.
You don't use SIP in at that point.
There's definitely the possibility of using WebRTC point-to-point and extending your ENUM registry to support peer-to-peer WebRTC addressing. Now, today, I think one of the problems is IPv4 and network address translation and having that point-to-point connectivity. some of that is slowly changing, and we're seeing a lot more IP6 deployments. But to me, the question of whether you use WebRTC or use SIP or any of that is really the same kind of thing. It depends on the type of endpoint, and you can support messaging addresses and all these other types of things over the DNS protocol as well. Mm-hmm. So it all depends on the application. Now, if you've got an address in your ENUM registry that's a SIP address, you've got to use SIP to communicate between the two. And I think that for a number of reasons, equipment that's out there, software that's out there, well-defined standards, that SIP is going to play a strong role in the telephone network going forward, regardless of the adoption of ENUM.
Mm-hmm. Well, without a doubt, there's a ton of SIP woven into the fabric of the existing networks, and that connectivity certainly is important. I guess the only question I'm raising, and I think you've answered it pretty well, Bayan, is if, let's say WebRTC were to take off like some of the over-the-top apps that are out there, like WhatsApp and Viber and so forth, it would seem to me that would create a strong vector where you're going basically browser to browser. If you can accomplish the lookup, the addressing lookup within an ENUM registry, all of a sudden there's a big, incentive to just go HTTP connectivity and keep it as simple and, let's say, as elegant as possible. The missing piece at this point is sort of a ubiquitous ENUM deployment that contains the addressing information that you need in order to set up that peer-to-peer connection. Is there anything?
Sure, and if every single person in the world is willing to use their web browser to communicate, you could get rid of SIP and say everyone's going to use WebRTC now. One of the beautiful things about telephone numbers is that no matter where you are in the world, and what equipment you have, you know that there's compatibility, that it's going to work, that your telephone is going to work with every other telephone anywhere in the world, that it's going to be able to route to any telephone anywhere in the world. And WebRTC is a very simple protocol that can allow some of these peer-to-peer connections. I think that there are lots of valid use cases for not doing things peer-to-peer as well. Mm-hmm. Including things on the routing as well as on the media side, whether it's applications for conference calling or PBXs or IVRs or these other types of things. And while you could hack a protocol like WebRTC to do some of those things for you by creating some sort of WebRTC back-to-back user agent and developing these services on top, a protocol like SIP is much better suited to doing these types of things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and SIP is obviously doing that type of functionality today. So, Peter, do you have any comments at this point?
Yeah, but the question to me is not about SIP, it's more about ENUM in a longer term. Do we need ENUM in a really longer term? So, and my answer to this question is that especially if we are talking about SIP, it's going to be there. WebRTC is coming. H323 is still there. In some countries, the old PSTN and SS7 signaling system is still in place, and that's the reason why we need at the moment ENUM to bridge these and ride on top of the current PSTN numbering system, which is the only uniform one-to-one numbering solution, even if you use Google Hangouts or WebRTC or whatever else. Those naming and numbering solutions, for instance, in Google Hangouts, there is an identity paradox behind that. For instance, I'm subscribed with 2 different email addresses. I was not sure which email address my invitation came to. So there is this identity problem behind all these separate naming and numbering solutions that are these separate communication solutions are using. And as we are talking about unified communication, a globally unified communication, we still have to ride on top of the good old PSTN numbering, and that's what ENUM solves at the moment. Maybe in the future this need will go away and we can have our own identity solved and mapped one-to-one to a number or whatever resource you have, a SIP URI maybe. And that's the point where ENUM will go. But until then, we need both SIP and we need ENUM still.
Yeah, I totally agree, Peter. The whole identity management issue is continuing to be a centerpiece for not only the all-IP transition, but even the functionality of what's happening today in the PSTN, in public safety, in all sorts of realms. And I think there's more and more attention to this identity management, and certainly, the telephone number or telephone number-like address is the ubiquitous not only connector but also identity management, even as flawed as it is, that we have today. And when I go to the grocery store, one of the ways that I can identify myself is via my telephone number. But the point you bring up, Peter, is that we have different personas and we have different public faces that we present to people. Friends and family see a different side of Jay than business and so forth. So I think this again is another compelling reason for the ENUM structure, that I think ENUM can accommodate these different personas. And I think the work that you're doing at ENUM moves that whole issue forward. So
just one comment, Jade. So the actual problem that we are solving with ENUM in our community is the bridging or the gap between H323 and SIP, because we have these 2 words. We have all GDS numbering here and there, and we have SIP URIs on the other side, and we are bridging with ENUM between the 2.
Mm-hmm. And what are you doing with WebRTC at this point? Anything?
Yep, we are definitely investigating WebRTC. WebRTC has the potential to be a disruptive technology for all, because basically you can use a plain web browser on any device to call, to make a call. We are at the moment developing a roadmap for research education, how to ride on the wave of the WebRTC. One minor thing that's lately happened is we sponsored the Big Blue Button, which is the open source web communication tool to include WebRTC protocol, and now it's available. So if you have a Big Blue Button server installed, which is fully open source, you can use the Chrome and the Firefox web browsers to call in without the need of basically installing any client on your device. So that's the thing, and from the roadmap point of view, we are looking for use cases and ways how the research education community can contribute to the development and the standardization of WebRTC, which will benefit the entire community, I think.
Great, that's awesome. By the way, Big Blue Button did one of the Friday VoIP user sessions, and I learned a lot about Big Blue Button at that point, and it does seem like that's a construct that's very well suited for your community, Peter. So, Bayan, anything you'd like to add at this point?
No, I think Peter's points are very valid. Whether or not ENUM is going to be adopted is a much bigger question for me than whether or not we can sit. There's with everything happening with the numbering transitions here in the U.S. and also Ofcom in the UK and other regulators around the world looking at that, as well as a lot of the focus within the United States on toll-free and SMS 800 right now, being that it's the only centralized numbering resource in the United States that's non-geographic. There's a lot of focus about how are we going to get this information about routing and control and authority out to users ultimately. And right now within SMS 800 you have about a dozen, a little bit more SCPs out there, and it's very difficult to write the code or to buy a package and certify it to connect and get a copy of this database. And one of the big issues that we have is talking about sharing location information, and so some of these next generation features that require specialized information is how do we get this information out to the user? Some of the routing can be done through something like ENUM, but it puts a lot of burden on the service provider, and architecturally, depending on how we want to split up the various layers, whether it's a two-layered system where you have service providers and users, or it's a three-layered system like SMS 800, there's more complexity behind the scenes, and I think only time will tell how ENUM and other systems work together in order to fill some of those gaps for us.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we could definitely use some platforms to experiment with, and you know, my hope is that over time, what Peter and his community is doing in the research arena with ENUM might very well work nicely with what we start to experiment with here in North America, you know, as the numbering test bed goes forward. I think there's an opportunity to start to share information, share experimentation, share collaboration with these various initiatives. And so, you know, that's my hope as things move forward. And I'm also hoping that it won't be too long before we see, you know, some of the North American community start to put up some platforms that can, you know, people can start to experiment with and hammer on and, you know, really use. So, however, that's been a slower process than we had anticipated at this point. So,
may I just one comment? So in our architecture that we are proposing, ENUM has nothing to do with the actual core routing. So we do the core routing using the SIP protocol mainly, and in our architecture we're offering session border controllers at the domains of the NRAN networks and the university networks. And our aim is to keep all the voice and video traffic on the research networks end-to-end. So we want to minimize the risk to drop off to PSTN or even to any public IP or internet provider's network. We want to keep the traffic, the voice or video calls between universities or students or staff or researchers end-to-end on the research networks. And we do that with the session border controllers, the distributed architecture session border controllers, and SIP trunking. And we use ENUM on top of that to discover numbering and find the the endpoints. That's what we do in our concept.
That's helpful, Peter. Do you see that same architecture existing as WebRTC starts to enter the picture? Or would you see something different opening up?
No, actually, what we are testing is some protocol and gateway tests between the session border controllers and WebRTC. I think the latest session border controllers are all speak WebRTC, although the standard is not finalized or various flavors of it, but it's ongoing work. But these session border controllers will talk WebRTC.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. That's good to know. All right, well, are there any other comments or questions or anything either of you would like to add at this point? Well, I'm delighted that the three of us had a chance to chat. This is recorded. Looks like there are some folks watching this either via the Hangouts or perhaps on the web. And we will continue having these workshops on the second Wednesday of the month, which will be at 5 p.m. Eastern, and then the third Wednesday of the month, which will be at 11 a.m. Eastern. And it's my hope that we'll actually have a platform up and running and have some code to work on and share and experiment with as the workshops move forward. There is a sister event called the PhoneWord Forum, which will be coming up on the 27th of August, and the topic likely will be over-the-top elements and services that are emerging. On September the 24th, the PhoneWord Forum will feature Martin Geddes and Hank Holquist of AT&T, and we're going to be talking about fit-for-purpose broadband, and this definitely touches upon the toll-free realm, toll-free broadband, and AT&T's offering of sponsored data. So I think that's going to be a really, really interesting session. And then in November, well, the October PhoneWord Forum is still open. In November, we will have the folks from CZ.NIC in the Czech Republic on talking about their ENUM platform and domain platform called FRED. So they've got about 9 or 10 countries around the world that are using the FRED architecture and platform to run the domain registries, as well as I believe a limited number of ENUM applications. So that's what we got on the horizon. I appreciate both of you joining today. I think this is a great conversation, and I think this is really an important way for us to start to collaborate, around the world and share notes, work together, and create something that's new. So, unless there's anything else, gentlemen, we'll call it a day. And again, I appreciate you both joining today.
Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity.
All right. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Brian. Goodbye.
Bye.